So remember, I've said it a million times over the last few years. Spending more on an audio piece will not guarantee you're going to get better sound for your tastes. It all comes down to your tastes. When you spend more on a piece of audio gear compared to a piece that's down here, it's going to sound different, but it's not going to necessarily sound better to your ears. All right, so I get questions often about the difference between mid-tier gear, high-end gear, the exotic gear, and even starter gear that might cost $100 or $200. Are there differences in the sound quality, and what are those sound differences? Why do some people pay $100,000, $200,000, $500,000 for a hi-fi system, while others are happy and content plunking down $1,000 for the whole kit and caboodle? Keep in mind, these are my honest feelings from the heart, from a guy who's been into audio for 35 years, right? Over the last few years, I've listened to a ton of gear that ranged in price from a couple $100 all the way up to $20,000, $25,000, $30,000 for one piece of gear. I've had a system in this room that equaled a $75,000 retail system. I had that system in here for a year. And I've had a system in here that cost a grand total of under $4,000. You'd be surprised to know that there are things about that $4,000 system I like better than the $75,000 system. But I'm going to tell you guys the main differences, right? So let's just start with, what do you get for that extra money? Say there's a $3,000 amplifier and it sounds great to you, and you're like, how could it get any better? But then you look over at a dealer and you see another integrated. We'll go with an integrated example. And that integrated is $18,000, right? Why would one be under $3,000 and one be $18,000? Well, a lot of it has to do with the company behind it, the parts they use to make the piece, the design that they put, the aesthetic, because some people buy gear just for the look, the aesthetic, the design of said piece. That's why a lot of people buy Apple products. They like the design. So let's say you have a piece that's $3,000 and it looks more like a black box, but it sounds really good. And then you have this, close to $20,000 piece that has like trim, gold trim and blitzy and meters and big fancy metal dials and all this bling. But inside of that piece, there are also expensive parts that were used to make that piece. So the reason that costs more is the person who designed it decided they wanted to charge more. The parts they use may be of much higher quality. They may offer a better warranty, and the design may appeal to your eye. But what about sound differences? My experience in sound differences between mid-level hi-fi gear, and I'll call mid-level something like if you have a whole system that costs anywhere between $5,000 and $7,000. Yes, that's what I would call mid-level, $5,000 to $10,000, let's say. Where a high-end level, as I said, I had a system in here that would retail for $75,000. I consider that high-end hi-fi. As far as the exotic systems that go for $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 by the time you put them together, I'm not really going to talk about those, because once you get into those, it's more really truly about the design, look, and you like big, heavy stuff. But there's some fine pieces in that world, right? Beautiful pieces. But we're going to stick with the high end, the mid end, and then I'll throw some thoughts about a lower tiered hi-fi system. The main difference you get between the mid and high end is in the sound. There is a sound difference. And I'll be honest, a lot of you probably would hate the sound of a high-end hi-fi system, right? A high-end hi-fi system, normally what I have found in the pieces I've had here, they focus on transparency, detail, that see-through nature to the music. But at the same time, a lot of those systems are kind of thin and recessed in the mid-range, and the bass, even with some of these high-end pieces, is very anemic. They focus a lot on the treble to give you those details and those airy highs. You'll get that holographic imaging, very detailed. Sometimes it'll be analytical. That imaging might be surgical. If you're searching for detail and you're searching for all of the information in that recording, a high-end system, say up to $100,000, can deliver that to you. For example, when I had my Fleetwood DeVille speakers in here being powered by the big Pass Labs amps, fancy Cord Dave DAC, right? All of these expensive pieces, that system was very revealing, but the speakers were not analytical. So while all of the gear was delivering all that information to the speakers were still putting the music out in an enjoyable way. But let's say I switched those speakers to a more analytical speaker, like say the Focal Diablos or Focal Utopias of any genre. They are going to be way more detailed in the treble, and some people do not like that sound. It can be fatiguing unless you dial in everything just right and your room is perfect. The higher you go in high end when buying gear means the more attention you're going to have to pay to your listening room, right? Because of this ruthless, revealing system that you're putting together when you're spending up to $100,000, if you're not careful, it can sound awful. I've heard awful systems that were in that range of $100,000 to $200,000. I thought it sounded bleached. I thought it was way too revealing, too surgical, too analytical, and I was happy going back home to my then, I think, $8,000 system that had flesh and bones to the music. I should say flesh and blood to the music. With mid-tier gear, you get a lot more flesh to the bones. The mid-range is usually fuller. There's less detail in the treble. The treble might be a little softer. The bass might be a little loose in some scenarios, but not all. But overall, you're getting a much more musical performance from mid-range gear. Remember, a system, say, up to $10,000. One example I'll give is these Bucard's A10, the anniversary 10s that I still have here. They come in for around $4,000, right? If you buy them right now, or depending on the finish or something, they're around $4,000 to $4,300. They sound as good to me as some $15,000 systems I've owned. They sound better to me than some of those systems I've owned that cost that much. And the reason is because they make me move, they make me groove. They have that mid bass and the bottom end, the foundation to the music that just sounds so good, and it makes your body rock. And the top end is not as ruthless or revealing as some of those high-end pieces, so you're not getting the surgical detail. But for me, that's okay. I prefer musical to surgical details. And a thing that I've done over the past 2.5 years in this room was try systems of all types. I wanted to try a low-end system. I wanted to try a mid-range system. I wanted to try a high-end system. And I've got to try all three. And I'll tell you right now, honestly, from the heart, I will not be going back to any kind of system that costs any kind of crazy money. For example, I would never again have a system in here that was $75,000 in retail cost. I've actually sold off a lot of my personal gear. I still have some review units here, but my personal gear, almost all of it has been sold off except for a couple of things. So I am going to build a system that is much more affordable, and I'm probably going to enjoy it more. And the reason being is because these ears right here are not the biggest fans of analytical, of uber detail, of speakers that are ruthlessly revealing. Some people love that. And I remember the first time I heard a high-end hi-fi system at a dealer, and they were something like $18,000 speakers. They had them hooked up to some beautiful Mark Levinson amps and who knows what else. And I listened to it, and for one song, I loved it. It was a Jules song, Foolish Games, just the vocal. And I was like, wow, that sounds so real. But then when the salesman put on some music with body, life, and spunk, it kind of fell flat. And I said, why do these sound so thin? He's like, oh, don't you hear the detail? The detail is what it's all about. And I walked out of there thinking, well, I would never pay that kind of money for that system. And I had a system at home that was under 10 grand that I loved much more. So remember, I've said it a million times over the last few years. Spending more on an audio piece will not guarantee you're going to get better sound for your tastes. It all comes down to your tastes. When you spend more on a piece of audio gear compared to a piece that's down here, it's going to sound different, but it's not going to necessarily sound better to your ears. That's why I always say you must audition in your own space, because everything makes a difference. Your room, your DAC, your streamer, your speakers, your amp, whatever you put in the chain is going to make a difference. It might not be a better difference. It might be a worse difference. It might be vice versa. Now, I've reviewed some low-cost products here recently that I actually recommended. I checked out a $180 integrated tube amp from Amazon, $180, that not only had a built-in DAC, but had a VU meter. And you know what? It's decent. It's not blowing my mind with richness, body, and drive, and everything else we look for. But man, 180 bucks and you get a pretty cool little integrated amp that sounds really good. Match it with some comparable speakers in the same price range, and you can have a little system in your room for under 500 bucks that'll make you groove and move. What's that system missing from something that's in the $5,000 range? A lot, really. You're missing a thing we call sound stage. And what that means is when you sit and listen, and say you're facing your speakers and say they're 7-8 feet away, you can literally close your eyes or even open them and envision a stage like you're at a concert, and you'll hear the bassist where the bassist is playing. You'll hear the drummer in the back behind the vocalist who's dead center. You might hear the guitar or banjo player to the right picking and a grinning. You might envision him grinning, but a sound stage with proper imaging, we can hear all of this placed in the stage. And what I have found, as you go up the chain in money, that detail, that imaging becomes more surgical, where you can hear pinpoint placements of everything. But is that real sounding? When I go watch a concert, I don't hear this pinpoint imaging. When I listen to music in the car, I don't hear this pinpoint imaging. So is high-end hi-fi even really a real sound, or is it so enhanced, right, by what they do with these amps and speakers, making them so revealing? Is it kind of presenting music in a different, more unnatural way? I've had people tell me that too. All I know is when I listen to a system in here, for example, I'll throw in some speakers, Klipsch Heresy 4s. I still love those speakers. No, they don't have a perfect mid-range. They don't have perfect bass. The treble can shout a little bit if you pair it with a harsh amp, but man, they have soul. They sound beautiful, and they're like $3,000. No, that's not cheap. And to some people, that's high end. But you got to remember, there's speakers out there that cost $1 million. There's speakers out there that cost $500,000 just for the speakers. If you have the money and you can imagine it, you can buy it pretty much, but that doesn't make it better. It just makes it different. I recently sold the Focal Diablos I have here. They were remarkable speakers, some of the best bookshelf speakers I've ever heard. I should say some of the most impressive, because there's no such thing as the best when we're talking about audio. There's no such thing as the best when we're talking about cameras, right? It's all personal preference. It's all just different. A $200 amp will sound different than a $10,000 amp. Will the $10,000 amp sound better? Maybe not to you. That's how it works with audio. Also, the high end, a lot of high end is made for people with a lot of money. People with a lot of money get bored. They look for new ways to spend that money. And if it's expensive, they equate that with performance. And that's not always the case. You can get just as beautiful performance from something that costs way less in some cases. Now, we can go back and talk about cheaper products that actually sound horrible. I've had a lot of those come through here. I've had a $3,000 integrated to me that sounded awful. I sent it back without reviewing it, and I said, what is this? This is not good. I had a $500 amp here that sounded so full of hiss and noise, I had to take it out immediately. At the same time, I've heard amps in here that were $1,300 that bested $4,000 amps. So it's all trial and error. It's all picking what you like. It's all going with your heart, right? So just remember, sound quality will be different from high end to mid end to low end. You can find some real bargains in the low end that actually will sound pretty dang good. And I'm talking a couple $100. But there are some things that are in that $200 to $500 range that are awful. and I would avoid like the plague. You go to the midline, right, where you're spending a few grand up to 10 grand for your entire system. This is, for me, the sweet spot, and you can get 98%, 95%, say, of a high-end system. Let me also say this. You can also assemble a really high-end system that sounds absolutely magical, refined, and beautiful, because as you go up in price, what I've noticed is the pieces get better made. There's less noise. It gets to the point where it's just jet black. You hear no hiss, no buzz, no nothing. It's just silent. And when a voice comes out of silence in a three-dimensional way, it can make the goosebumps stand up on your arms, the hair on your neck stand up, and you can just say, wow, I feel like I'm in the room with this artist. Can you get that from a mid-level system? Yes, to some extent. But of course, there's high-end pieces that are garbage. There's high-end pieces that are awesome. There's mid-range pieces that are garbage. There's mid-range pieces that are awesome. There's low-range pieces that are garbage. There's low-range pieces that are very, very good. So I'm not one to ever say you got to spend a ton of money in hi-fi. I've always said, what you pay does not mean, if you pay more, it doesn't mean you're going to get better. You're just going to get different. And what I said here was just based on my experience over all these years of trying so many amps. The higher I went in the price, the more revealing, the more refined, usually the less bass I would hear. And then when I go down to the mid-tier, I get more bass, I get more mid-range bloom, a softer treble, and usually it just makes me move more. If I go to the lower end, a few $100s, I can still get into it, but I hear more noise, it's more flatter sounding, it doesn't have the three-dimensional kind of thing going on, but you can still enjoy it because you don't hear that in the car. You don't hear that so much with headphones unless you have special headphones. You don't hear that so much listening to your Bluetooth speaker. So it all depends on what you want as your goal. I'm going to listen to these Bucards for a while, and I'm enjoying this Ava system as well, but I really don't have the desire to spend $50,000, $75,000 on an audio system. Been there, tried it. I can say I've done it. I enjoyed it, but it's just too much for the differences that are there. So I know I talked, I blabbed. I don't script these out. I don't read from a teleprompter. It all comes from right here and right here. And by the way, I did get my new light. I ordered it from B&H. I got it for under $200. It was like $800 less than my last light, and I like it better. There you go. It works that way with other things as well. So I hope you enjoyed this one. I will see you guys in the next one. I will have a review of many things coming up. I have like a list this long of reviews I'm working on. So stay tuned. I am getting to them, and I will see you in those.